So we'll move towards the fourth panel. And I know that the last three topics have been very, very interesting. And so the fourth one is equally important. It's about trade, innovation, and IPR. And for this panel, again, we have four very eminent speakers. So I'll start by inviting Dr. Gopichand Katragadda. He's the Group Chief Technology Officer at Tata Sons. In this role, he drives technology and innovation for Tata Group, leveraging cross-company synergies. He also serves as director on the boards of select Tata companies. Previously as a chairman and managing director of GE India Technology Center, he facilitated funding of cross-business innovation, championed commissioning of new research labs. Dr. Katragadda provides voice of technology for various industry forums and bodies, including CII and NASSCOM. He has over 30 publications, 5 patents, and also has co-authored a book on innovation called SMASH. Welcome, Dr. Katragadda. Next, I would like to invite Professor Keith Marcus, Professor of Economics and former Associate Dean of Social Sciences at the University of Colorado, Boulder, USA. He has been a lead economist in the Development Research Group at the World Bank. His current research focuses on international economic aspects of protecting intellectual property rights. He's the co-author of Intellectual Property Rights in the Global Economy and co-editor of International Public Goods and the Transfer of Technology under Globalized Intellectual Property Regime. Welcome, Professor Marcus. Next, I'd like to invite Professor Daniel Sokol from Law at University of Florida. Professor Sokol focuses his teaching and scholarship on complex business issues from early stage startups to large multinational businesses. A highly prolific scholar, Professor Sokol has published his works in law reviews, peer-reviewed journals, books, and popular press. He's co-editor of leading 2 volumes on Antitrust Economics Handbook and Antitrust Compliance Handbook. He is an honorary fellow of the Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs. He also serves as academic advisor of the US Chamber of Commerce. Welcome, Professor Sokol. Next, I'd like to invite Shubhashis Gangopadhyay, is founder and research director of India Development Foundation and professor of emerging market finance at University of Groningen, Netherlands. He has published widely in journals on development economics, international trade, industrial organization, regulatory economics, and finance. He has also co-authored and co-edited a number of books in economics and finance. He's the chief editor of the Journal of Emerging Market Finance and is the president of 2 professional societies. Welcome, Shubhashis Gangopadhyay. Last but not the least, I'd like to invite Chirantan Chatterjee. Chirantan is assistant professor in economics and public policy of ISB and research fellow at Bharati Institute of Public Policy and Max Institute of Healthcare. His research interests are in applied microeconomics, economics of innovation, and pharmaceutical economics. He has been published in top peer-reviewed journals, and his research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, Pfizer, and Qualcomm. Welcome, Chirantan. And also, as most of you know, he is the crucial member of this and the co-chair of this conference and has made this happen. So thanks, Chirantan, and over to you.
Thank you, Rima. This is the last panel of the day. And between us and nice evening, I think we stand with this onerous burden to make sure that we remember that intellectual property and innovation today in India is not a standalone activity, but we live in a globally integrated economy. And in fact, even if you look at TRIPS, that was essentially a trade instrument. So that's something which has motivated the construction of this panel. And we have a group of very eminent panelists. And I will not deliberate further on what they will talk on, but I would raise some big questions that still remain unanswered in terms of empirical evidence. For example, does stronger IPR really incentivize innovation, which is essentially something I had worked in my dissertation. Evidence seems mixed across economies over time. Does stronger IPR result in economic development? That is another key issue where empirical findings are mixed. And what is the relationship between trade and IPR over time? So we want to answer some of these questions where we have over various periods of history and across economies, some evidence on what research has given us. But at the same time, we also want to make sure that in the discussion on trade and intellectual property and innovation, we do not forget the role of competition law. So, we have the scholars in competition law with us, and the role of globally integrated firms like the Tata Group in how they are addressing and dealing with creative destruction and the fourth industrial revolution. So, we'll hear some nice perspectives on interdisciplinarism in all of these discussions. So, without further ado, I will request Dr. Gopichand Katragadda to take the stage and share his thoughts. We'll try to maintain a little bit of time discipline.
15 minutes still?
Yeah.
Is my presentation up?
Yeah.
It's a pleasure and privilege to be here today. I had the honor of addressing some of the ISB students in the past. I understand today we have a lot of faculty members as well as folks from the legal community. I'll learn more than I will discuss with you. I look forward to the comments from my panel as well. But I already learned quite a bit from the previous panel. What I thought I'll focus on is how to. So the topic for today is innovation, intellectual property and competition. So the how to aspects, at least one perspective I would like to share with you. For me, and like was discussed previously, innovation is new ways of creating value. And the previous speaker from the last panel actually said, whenever you create, there is value. Sometimes it's not so easy. I'll just share a quick story to illustrate a point, and I'll discuss this a little bit later as well. We developed a way to reduce the amount of pesticide used, reduce the amount of time taken for the pesticide to be sprayed, and do it in a manner which is cost effective and produce more, right, and use less water as well. However, when we went into the field with this solution, the farmers, and this was, I had gone to Raichur with the team, the farmers were very excited about the technology. But when they said that, when they heard that we could produce more from the same fields that they had, their question was, would you buy the extra produce? Because we do not know how to sell it. Right? So sometimes finding that new ways of creating value is not so straightforward, but innovation is about taking it to value. So you do not stop on the way, you take it to value. Intellectual property is protecting that creative new ways of creating value, and competition is what keeps us constantly innovating rather than become a one-time innovator. So I'll share a few stories of that, but first I wanted to share a model. Definitely I'm not going to go through each one of these bullets for you. Some of you will be familiar with what's on the slide, but I'll just share this in terms of a method of looking at what is round the corner in terms of innovation. So some folks will go left to right, some folks will go right to left. There is no correct answer. When you go from trends and determine what are the needs and serve those needs using the latest technologies, you're probably using a method which is going to get you about 80% of your revenues anyway. But 20% of your revenues, if you're greatly innovative, will come when you push technology. Right? So it is important for you to also be cognizant that the revenues is one thing, but profitability, greater profitability will come when you're able to push technology as well. And the way I think about it is that technology is something which is changing rapidly, and each day you see so much hitting the shore that you can be confused, scared, whatever be your emotion, it is not going to be easy. However, if you track it at a point of time when it is still science, when it is still a new material, and ride the wave along with the science and material into the time when it becomes technology and then goes on to meet a market need, then you are going to be a player who will make a difference with these technologies, because you are not scrambling to fit into something which has been developed, something which has been protected, and something where you are not global first. So that's the story I would like to share, and of course in discussions afterwards, if any of these bullets intrigues you, I'll be happy to discuss further. At the Tata Group, we are not one company, we are multiple companies. There is not one thing that we do. We do pretty much all that is there to do which is interesting. But all that we are doing is changing, and that's the point of this chart. There is no way we can relax and say we are big and we have the ability to invest like we did in the past. We can create hundreds of thousands of jobs. Nobody else can, and hence we will lead. That age is gone. Today you have to be innovative. You have to be technically competent to be able to even survive. So in order to be able to play in a global market and not only survive, but be able to lead, then you have to be global first. Right? So that's where if you're in digital, it's no longer sufficient to say, I have created 300,000 jobs in a very innovative business model. I was the first to create that business model. That is not sufficient. Today it is about automation of services. I can deploy IT solutions at scale without the intervention of a single human being. Right? I have to be able to create revenues, I have to be able to create profits, and I have to be able to create jobs when this is the scenario. Because we are the Tata Group, we will create jobs. In automotive, it is about emissions. Electrification is one of the ways to look at emissions. And of course, connected and autonomous is the digital revolution, which is entering every sphere of whatever we do. So there's no longer going to be a competitive edge only if we have the best designers of an automotive which is based on an IC engine, and the IC engine itself is the greatest design. So you have to be able to talk the language of the digital world as well. Of course, if you talk to an engineer at Jaguar Land Rover, he will tell you that some of these cars which are coming out today, which are connected, autonomous, and electric, are not even cars. But we cannot compete with that position. We have to move on and say that if it is not a car, it is a mobile phone on wheels. That's what we will deliver. Similarly, consumer products, all of them are moving towards wellness and premiumization. Can you imagine a coffee which calms you? I have not had one, but we do produce one. So that is premiumization. That is to be able to produce a product for a population, a market size of one, through a large company. Wellness, if you're making a watch, it is of little use anymore, so you have to incorporate wellness features into it. If you're in manufacturing and materials, you have to know about 3D printing, you have to know about the industrial IoT, you have to leverage those, and you have to produce new materials, such as 2D materials, which include graphene, which I'll briefly mention later. Defense is no longer going to be only about weapons. Cyber is equally a weapon, and it's been used effectively, as you have seen many recent discussions on the topics. Governments have been created, and probably governments will fall based on what's happening in the cyber world. Agriculture, India has the largest amount of percentage population in agriculture with the least amount of productivity, and that's not acceptable, and you have seen that in the lives of the farmers. So that has to change. We have to increase the productivity. Infrastructure like energy generation used to be centralized. It's increasingly becoming distributed. The desired end state is to be producing in each home enough electricity for yourself and enough to feed back into the grid. Communications, Tata Com, as an example, carries 25% of the world's internet traffic on its lines. But it is not sufficient. You need to be talking about LoRa, which is ability to connect locally in a city, in a factory, provide for safety of workers, provide for safety of various other citizens that you have. So everything that we do is changing. I wanted to share some examples of how we look at this change in the face and create global first and face up to the competition, and how we look at competition as a healthy aspect rather than something that we get worried about. So we wanted to play in the area of wearables. But wearables is an area where you have great big companies having invested a lot of money over multiple years. So we said that if we want to play in this field and compete, we will do it on our terms, on the turf that we know how to play, which is our factories. Nobody knows factories better than us. We have all kinds of factories. So we have steel factories, which are material factories. We have automotive factories, which are assembly and component factories, we have chemical factories, we have factories of all kinds. So who else can create a product for the safety of our workers? And we feel that we should care for the safety of our workers more than anybody else, and we hence produced a wearable for the factory safety of our workers. And this is much more onerous than even a wellness wearable. So not only I have to track pulse and the number of steps, which has some use but not all that much on a factory floor, I have to track if a person slips, falls, is motionless, I have to track the ambient gases, I have to track if the person enters an area which he or she is not trained to be in, and many more things. So these are the things that we incorporated. And again, we were able to bring multiple Tata Group companies together and external companies, including startups. So we are not of the illusion that we will create everything within our home. We would like to do as much as possible, create intellectual property, and then collaborate. But we are very much open to leveraging intellectual property created elsewhere for applications that matter to us. Similarly here, who will care for our farmers? Who will care for the people who are spraying pesticides? You have seen deaths due to improper use of pesticides. So here's an application where we were able to use existing drone technology. So I requested my team not to work on the drones, though they were very excited to be working on drones, but to focus on the dispensation mechanism, to design the nozzles for the right droplet size for the pesticide to be sprayed and retained on the crop, to determine for paddy, for tea, for Bengal gram, what height should you be flying, what speed should you be flying at, and at what rate should you be dispensing the pesticide. So that's what they did over the past 2 or 3 years. Again, from a policy standpoint, we have worked with the government to say we cannot lead the world if we cannot get a policy out in 3 years' time. From August of 2014, we have not been able to get a drone policy out, and that is something which is unacceptable, including the fact that we are part of the solution. It's not about complaining. We need to be able to influence and get this policy out. We luckily have a draft now, but it's still something which we need to get out there into the field. Again, there are some programs when you're in R&D, you'll be told that, and in fact this was told to me by my colleague, Gopi, you must be stupid to be working on fuel cells. So I told my colleague, thank you very much for the compliment. In my job, I have to be working at least 25% on stupid stuff, and this actually means I'm meeting my quota of stupid stuff. So fuel cells and hydrogen as a fuel is not a reality today yet, but it is increasingly becoming possible even in India, because of the shale gas availability, because of the import of LNG into this country. From the LNG you can reform and get hydrogen. See, the issue with hydrogen is it doesn't exist as hydrogen in nature. You have to either get it from fossil fuel or you have to split it from water, and hence it becomes a carrier if you split it from water, or you're using fossil fuel anyway if you're getting it from one of the fossil fuels. But you can do it much more cleaner and in a much more controlled manner, and that is the case for hydrogen. So don't get lulled into this, you can use hydrogen and all that you will generate is water kind of a story. That is not true. Your hydrogen doesn't exist, you have to make it, and when you're making it, you will be impacting the environment. So it's a question of optimizing the environmental impact. And what we did was, again, from a global first standpoint, from an intellectual property standpoint, we developed the world's first closed cathode air-cooled fuel cell. Closed cathode is important in India because of heat and dust. If it is open cathode, it won't have the life we need. So that's the way to think about global first intellectual property. You have to be true to where you are because you understand that market and innovate for that region. Material of the future, graphene. Here I would like to acknowledge the help of Professor Anil Gupta, who was here earlier as well, who connected us to some of the indigenous ways of looking at materials, which was an inspiration for one of the approaches that we took to making graphene, which is starting from a material called lakka in India, or seed lac, and to use modern engineering techniques to produce graphene from that. Low-grade graphene, but low cost, and hence can be used in large volumes. So again, another angle, which is even including raw materials. So we have a good supply chain of lakka in India, because right from the king's time, when it was used for royal seals, till now, when it's used for many industrial purposes, the raw material is available in good quantity. And the interesting thing you should know of how the raw material is produced, it's an Indian insect interacting with an Indian tree, which produces a resin, which makes this raw material called lakka. So if you can tap into something like that, you have your supply chain, and your innovation is going to be able to create value. Again, I don't want you to read this chart as much as I want to share with you that when people talk about industrial IoT, what they miss is the domain. You need to be able to talk domain when you talk about areas such as industrial IoT. You go to a power plant and say, I will do industrial IoT. They'll say, what is that? They'll know, we'll connect all your equipment. Well, we have been doing that for 35 years now. No, we will be able to deploy many more sensors at a much lower cost. To do what? Right? So you need to be able to answer that question. Say, I will reduce your boiler tube failures, then we are talking. I'm not going to stop there. I'll say, well, how? And how do you know my boiler tube failures better than I do? So, but the point is that you need to know domain. Going digital and trying to solve the world's problems will not be sufficient unless you try to learn the domain you're trying to solve. One area which is significant and coming up is AI. So I thought I'll just share a few experiments that we have done here as well. I can use deep learning. I've used deep learning, by the way, for 25 years, including my master's work. We've used neural networks. But of course, it has improved quite a bit because of great computational power today. New algorithms such as convolution neural networks have added some additional value as well. But the outcome is exponentially better if it is natural language processing, if it is voice recognition, if it is image processing. So here's an example of image processing. Can I use recent data to predict which shirt will sell better? I like Rishi's shirt, but I can put it into the system and see whether I can sell it for top dollar. And you can do that based on. So again, in the world of fashion, you cannot say I'll take 10 years worth of data. You have to take very recent data, but there is tons of such data, including reviews and comments, right? And the price even. So you can crawl and get all this information for free legally without any privacy concerns. You can also use it to mine your customers' feedback. So here's an example where we looked at Tata Motors, one of the models. Of course, we looked at Indian driver frustration analysis also, and then the frustration analysis of a Tata Motors particular model. I'll not tell you the name of the model. But the funny thing is that while we were working on the engine, while we were working on the fuel economy, while we were working on the pricing, leaks, and so on and so forth, the biggest problems were that our service centers were extremely poor, our dealers were extremely poor in handling the customers. So we had to put more dollars over there. And while we might have known it intuitively, by just doing, I shouldn't say just because it requires work, but by deploying AI and looking at data which is available, I'm able to get a more accurate way of looking at such information. There's a lot happening in the world out there, and we have to connect to that, and we do. Be it in India, IIT Kharagpur, we have the Industrial IoT Center of Excellence. Again, two very good programs from the government of India, the Uchchatar Avishkar Yojana program and Imprint program allow us to put such programs in place. IIT Madras, we have the Center of Excellence for Graphene. We also have upcoming the Center of Excellence for micro manufacturing. And then we have various areas that we connect to globally. I'll just give you one example. It's important the data that you get from one node, as you have seen in the recent time, one node being us, and the data that we have anonymized for privacy reasons. But it is also wonderful to get the data of our connections, which also you have seen in recent times. And you can use it for good purposes and in a legal way as well. And one such way Yale is using it is for figuring out who are the influencers in a community to help that community adopt polio vaccination better. So we can also use similar techniques in the industry, and that is just a quick example of how we are engaging with the universities. With that, I'll thank you for listening. And in India, I think from a standpoint of what industries need to do, we need to invest much more for us to be a nation of innovation. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Katragadda. I won't give too much of a prelude. I think I just want to remind the audience that Paul Krugman was in Delhi a couple of weeks back, and he was talking about artificial intelligence and what it would do to sources for competitive advantage of the economy here. And it is in that context we can see the word globalism, we can see the use of interdisciplinarism, public-private partnerships, thinking about market as a global thing coming back repeatedly in Gopi's talk. So over to Keith to help us navigate how the policy environment helps the firm in this context.
Well, thank you to Chirantan and to Rima, to Raj for the invitation and setting up this wonderful conference. We've really enjoyed our week here in Delhi. What I want to talk about today is just much more general than the actual specific results that I will say a few things about. But what I think is an interesting and very important policy question that economists really don't know anything about yet, and we're just beginning to try to tackle this question. And it is, as you can see from the title of this presentation, we have seen increasingly since the TRIPS agreement at the WTO, the implementation of new trade agreements or extended trade agreements that have in them very extensive requirements for protecting intellectual property that go well beyond the TRIPS agreement. And the simple question that raises is, what is that doing? So you will certainly find advocates from the European Union, from the United States, and certainly even now increasingly from Korea and Japan within the context of the TPP, asking for these very strong levels of protection for intellectual property. But are they affecting innovation? Are they affecting trade? Are they affecting investment? We don't yet know. So this is a new trade agenda, a research agenda, I should say, that I and my colleagues are beginning, and some others are finding this interesting as well. So to get to this, international economists like me, I often thought of as an innovation economist, but I really think of myself as a trade specialist. We tend to focus our analysis on commercial policies like tariffs, investments, service barriers, and how they affect technological change, what transport costs do, and all of that. But let me back up 1 second here. But those we study because they're kind of easily measured. We have a lot of data about tariffs. We have a lot of data about transport costs. We can sort of measure things like changes in technology to some degree. But far less studied, but I think at least as important for trade and investment and everything else, are all of these trade-related regulatory systems, like rules of origin and investment regulations and competition policy, and financial markets regulation, technical product standards, and how labor rights are protected, and then intellectual property rights, the subject for this talk. If you've tried to read the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, you know, if you do that, by all means, get yourself a very stiff pot of coffee and a lot of time, but what you will find is that there are really extensive requirements in all of these areas and many others. So trade agreements, we think of them as tariff-cutting exercises, and they are, but this is what they're about now. And I think to some degree the United States pulled out of it because there were some concerns about what it all meant, to be honest. So this globalized IPR system, the last 20 plus years have seen an unprecedented expansion and harmonization of protection for intellectual property rights. This is what we've been discussing here the last day and a half. So you know all about the TRIPS at the WTO and what it took for India to become compliant to that, with that agreement. It's the most remarkable and significant international agreement on intellectual property rights up to its time, because it, for the first time, besides being comprehensive across countries, subjected intellectual property treatment to dispute settlement, and that's something new. But since that time, we've seen additional treaties at the World Intellectual Property Organization. We've seen these TRIPS plus requirements in pharmaceuticals and increasingly in digital trade and e-commerce and in enforcement and in many other areas in various preferential trade agreements. TRIPS, this is an interesting thing that I'm not sure is widely understood or appreciated. The TRIPS agreement commits every country who's a member of the WTO to offer any change in its intellectual property regime to all other WTO members on an MFN basis. So even if there's an agreement within a small group of countries in a preferential trade agreement to have TRIPS plus standards, they must be then applied to all other countries as a member of the WTO. And this is clearly ratcheting up standards globally in a way that is kind of unprecedented. And you know, I think the United States itself sometimes negotiates these trade agreements in order to commit itself to having even stronger standards than it might otherwise have in this area. And that isn't just intellectual property rights. There are those kinds of MFN agreements in a lot of these regulatory areas as well. And then if you've paid much attention to the investment protection guarantees, to intellectual property rights and bilateral investment treaties and so on, they're quite significant as well. What we've seen in the last 15 years or so is the application of investment protection standards to intellectual property rights, so that, that if you're an investor in a country and you have some patent or copyright or something like that, and you think that a local regulatory change is having some negative effect on the value of that intellectual property right, you can try to get some compensation for that. So what about these IP-related preferential trade agreements? Currently, there are well over 400 regional or preferential trade agreements in the world, more if you include sector-specific agreements. 50 of them, as of 2015, have intellectual property chapters that vary in their complexity, although they're certainly getting more complex over time. And most of these involve a developed country partner with a developing country partner, or a series of developing country partners. So in that context, it really is about ratcheting up protection within the developing world through the promise of market access in the United States or Europe. But there, you will even observe among developing country preferential trade agreements that are south-south in their orientation, they increasingly feature these kinds of agreements in intellectual property. And of course, the argument here is that if you don't protect intellectual property rights, then you're kind of branding your economy as one that's not friendly to investment. And these kinds of regulatory requirements will in fact attract investment. I think there's some truth in that, to be sure, but what we don't know is exactly how these effects work out through these preferential trade agreements. Currently, there are 82 countries that are now members of at least one such preferential trade agreement. I'll come back here in a moment, but you can see the numbers. The first chart on your left is all IP-related preferential trade agreements. First in the red, the number of such agreements, that's come to 50 or so now, and the number of countries, about 82 as of 2015. TPP has just been agreed by about 11 countries, excluding the United States. And so that will bring in another set of countries, and certainly a major agreement. In the central panel, it's U.S. preferential trade agreements that have these kinds of TRIPS plus requirements in them. Smaller number of agreements, smaller number of countries, but there's certainly rigorous protection. And then the last one is the demonstration of what's been happening when there are preferential trade agreements where one side of the negotiation is the European Union or the EFTA, European Free Trade Agreement Association. So these things are growing. There's no question about that. So this is an econometric paper. I'm not going to show you long tables. I just don't think that's in anybody's interest. What I'll do is try to tell you what the analysis is and summarize the findings. But mostly, this is very preliminary, sort of setting out a path for going forward with this kind of analysis. So what we're going to do in this econometric exercise is to define something we're going to call treatment preferential trade agreements as those in which either the United States or the European Union is a partner. The idea here being that those are the agreements where you have one pretty dominant negotiating partner that really wants this kind of regulatory treatment in these agreements, And so we're going to think of those as the ones that will be specifically focused on strong IPRs. These agreements do vary in their legal coverage. So just to give you a sense of it, this is a diagram that simply shows you what's been happening across issues in these agreements. And there are many such issues, ranging from national treatment and MFN and so on, all the way through the kind of enforcement that's required, what are the TRIPS plus standards in pharmaceuticals, test data, all of these kinds of things that I think you're somewhat familiar with. I guess I've lost track of where things stand with the India-EU agreement, if it's still even in anybody's mind to finish that thing, but I'm sure that that agreement would have very extensive kinds of protection mechanisms like this as well. All right, so all of this is really a potentially rich area for research on the economic effects of intellectual property rights and regulatory chapters of preferential trade agreements. Here are some examples of questions you could ask. Do these IP-related preferential trade agreements matter beyond the effects of TRIPS? So that's question one. I mean, we all know that all these countries are members of TRIPS. Why do we go to the trouble of putting in even additional requirements if there's some question about whether that will have so much effect? So do they matter beyond the effects of TRIPS itself? Are there impacts on trade, FDI, licensing, innovation? Are there interactions between intellectual property rights and tariff cutting in these PTAs? This is an entirely unstudied question. So if you're looking for research areas in international trade and IP, here's one. If you think about it for a moment, if you're a country, then you're going to join an agreement with the United States, and you know that what this agreement is going to do is commit both partners to cutting tariffs. Well, that will affect the competition that faces your domestic technology-oriented companies. And so that might affect your willingness to engage in the intellectual property agreements as well. So there are these interesting trade-offs that we know next to nothing about. So this paper is really the first attempt out there at the most basic question. Do IP-related preferential trade agreements have exceptional or differential effects on member countries' aggregate trade flows? So here's what we're going to try to do. Our analysis is use a difference-in-difference approach to study the imports and exports of countries that are in these agreements versus countries that are not. We apply the methods to both TRIPS effects, because we're going to try to sort out or condition on being part of TRIPS, and then having these additional agreements as well. So the data sample, all countries in the Comtrade database, that's the UN Comprehensive Database of Trade. Exports and imports broken down into high intellectual property goods, so goods that are quite sensitive to intellectual property, and low IP goods, those which are not. And then we'll break that down even further, as you'll see. Oh, there it is, into specific IP-intensive sectors. So our identification is going to be based upon several important differences. One, the subset of countries that joined one of these IPAs, intellectual property agreements, excuse me, with the United States or the European Union. Those are the treatment agreements. Others did not. So they may be in trade agreements, but they're not in these IP-related trade agreements. And we'll also break those countries down by income groups or income levels. Corresponding differences in the dates at which countries came into compliance with TRIPS. This is important, right? If you want to be sure that a country is already compliant with TRIPS before you try estimating these difference effects. So the second difference then is effects should differ between high IP goods and low IP goods, using various definitions of what those things are. Again, it makes some sense intuitively, but I think the past regression analysis in this general area suggests that it's true that the impact of intellectual property rights agreements generally in international trade affect high IP goods much more than they affect low IP commodities. And third difference, our preferred specification focuses on countries joining IPAs, again, after they become compliant with TRIPS. So that's where we're going to be using what we're using to estimate these things. Endogeneity, we take TRIPS and IPR's rules and PTAs to be exogenously imposed on most of these PTA partners. That's a weak assumption, I can tell. Well, let me just justify it and then say a bit more about it. So developing and emerging countries, and they're most of the partner countries in these agreements, I think are generally not likely to adopt such rules endogenously. They might certainly adopt TRIPS-like rules, but these TRIPS plus standards in pharmaceuticals and in e-commerce and in digital trade and so on, they're quite rigorous. So you do wonder if that would be the case. For most PTA members, these IPR chapters are seen as secondary to gaining market access. So the reason that these developing countries join such agreements is because they're going to get more secure market access in the United States or in Europe, and that'll generate some investment effects within the agreement and from outside the agreement, and that's beneficial. But one other thing I'll say about that, it's not in these slides, but we do a lot of sort of external validation to see if it looks like these agreements are the outcome of prior high trade or intensive trade in high IP goods or an investment in intellectual property sensitive areas. And it turns out there really just isn't that correlation. So these do seem to be fairly exogenously selected in that context. So here are the essential questions. Again, is there an impact of IPAs on high IP versus low IP trade? And is there a difference between TRIPS and intellectual property agreements in this context? The regression, several, lots of them in the paper, but here's the basic idea. So the left-hand side is just trade, either exports or imports, for country I in sector S, S being high IP versus low IP in year T. And we regress that on GDP of the importing or exporting country and then an interaction with high IP goods in GDP. So in that sense, this is kind of a gravity kind of equation. And then, so IPA is a dummy variable that sorts out or picks out these particular treatment agreements. So beta 3 then is a coefficient that tries to measure whether joining one of these agreements has an effect on trade in low sort of non-technology goods itself. Then there's this interaction term between that dummy variable and the high IP goods. So beta 4 is really the coefficient we're interested in. Do we see some specifically different effect on high intellectual property intensive commodities in trade when these countries are a member of one of these agreements? Same kind of structure for TRIPS, and then a bunch of dummy variables or fixed effects. And I'll just point out that this is quite a rigorous specification because we have the country year dummies in there. So this really sweeps out all kinds of other things that might be confounding these. This is just the same regression, but broken down by country groups. So we break down our country groups into low income, middle income, and high income, just to see if there are interesting differences. So key results for high IP goods. Market size matters for both imports and exports, and there is a positive interaction trade between GDP and high IP sectors. That's not a surprise, but I would just point out this is quite interesting for a large economy like India. It does appear that in these technologically oriented high IP sectors, copyright, patent kinds of sectors, that being a large economy generates more sensitivity between market size and trade. So that actually gives you something of a market advantage in these kinds of commodities. It has something to do with scale economies, I presume. Being a member of one of these agreements doesn't seem to have a lot or very much effect directly on imports and exports. But when you break these things down by income groups, we get some interesting results. In poor countries, and that's the low-income countries, IPA membership seems to cause low IP imports, so textiles and so on, to fall significantly. But imports of the technologically sophisticated commodities tends to rise. That's kind of a comparative advantage effect in the context of these agreements. Imports in middle-income countries seem to be kind of insensitive to IPA membership, and TRIPS seems to raise imports of high IP goods in middle-income nations. That's consistent with prior work in this area that I and other people have done about the TRIPS agreement. This IPA membership seems to have very little effect on exports of low-income economies. So as far as low-income countries are concerned, what it does is it tends to increase imports of high IP commodities, but have not much effect otherwise. But these things significantly expand exports of high technology goods in middle-income countries. So places like China, Brazil, Mexico, and I think India would be in this category if it joined such agreements. What they tend to do is really increase in a significant way, and I think we've identified things so that they're sort of conditional upon being in TRIPS and everything else in these middle-income countries. So it's a pretty significant impact. TRIPS membership does seem to diminish exports overall in both groups, but by less in the high IP commodities. And there's robustness just throughout this. The last part of this, and then I'll just conclude and stop, is breaking this all down by types of commodities. So these are particular high intellectual property sensitive goods. And you can see the list at the bottom. So analytical instruments, biopharmaceuticals, chemicals, ICT, medical devices, production technologies. These are the kinds of technologies and products you'd expect to have some particular sensitivity to this question. And so what we find is for high-income countries, the US and others like that, both imports and exports of biopharmaceuticals are sensitive to IPA membership. So put that in perspective. It says that when American and European negotiators are asking for these TRIPS plus requirements or these TRIPS plus provisions, it actually has a strong effect on their exports of these commodities. Same thing is true in these other, in 3 of these other areas. For middle-income economies, the export interactions are significantly positive for all of the high-tech sectors. So again, that's consistent with what I was talking about before. For reasons that we need to sort out, and I have some suggestions, but for reasons we need to sort out, it appears to be the primary trade effect of IPA membership. It builds exports of high-technology commodities in these middle-income countries. Low-income countries have generally positive but modest import impacts, but significantly negative effects in these IPA interactions. So except for biopharmaceuticals, there's not much effect on exports there, but there's certainly some effect on imports. And the TRIPS interaction coefficients are again significantly positive for middle-income imports. I'm just going to skip through all of this robustness stuff for you. Conclusions tell you where this is going to go. So the initial evidence here is that IP-related preferential trade agreements do have an important effect on the composition of trade. The imports of these high IP commodities seem to be stimulated by IPA membership most in low-income countries, but exports are more sensitive in middle-income countries. In many dimensions, these IPA effects dominate those of TRIPS, so you can see why countries may want to move beyond TRIPS in this context. But this work needs to be extended and refined. I'll just tell you where we're working now. This is aggregate trade in these sectors. We're looking at bilateral trade in these same sectors to see if there's more sensitivity that way. That'll allow us to look at trade creation, trade diversion issues in this context, and we've also put together a substantial patent database to look at whether there's some kind of innovation effect going on here as well. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Keith. So from firm behavior, we just had some exposure to rigorous econometric work that informs international policy making. Maybe this is also time to invite Danny Sokol from University of Florida to share his thoughts on how we should think about entry and competition. Firms might behave in a certain way, but industries evolve and policymakers step in. So Danny's insights will be very helpful. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody for being here. My presentation is going to build off of some prior work that I've done and some work that I'm doing, but also thinking about how law matters. So all of you are wondering, what's the lawyer going to say? What's the lawyer going to say? So what I'm going to tell you actually is that the way we tend to compartmentalize, whether in a business school or let's say in a large company like Tata, we tend to think in certain kind of silos, right? The marketing people don't exactly talk to the IS people, who don't exactly talk to the finance people, et cetera. Let me put it in perspective of real world work and say they don't talk enough. So engineers are great. I love engineers, right? How to get from point A to point B to point C. Then you get a number of people who are trained in business who have MBAs that say, well, the only thing we care about is at point C, how can we monetize this? Then you get the lawyers in the room. The lawyers say, what's the precedent behind point C? And the problem is none of these three groups are really speaking to each other in ways that really break down their disciplinary boundaries. And I think the future really requires us to work through these interdisciplinary boundaries. Or put differently, I have a president that likes to talk about building a wall. I want to build bridges instead. So let me explain what that means. That means somehow law, technology, and business come together to create spectacular things. But in many ways, we now understand that, and I think the presentation that Gopi did was spectacular from that standpoint, really showing how a large conglomerate is able to do amazing things and create all kinds of synergies across different units. The real problem that we face is how do you convince government regulators what the business is and how these businesses can actually create efficiencies that somehow benefit consumers. So I'm going to talk about that because in addition to talking about bridges across disciplines, I could talk about actual bridges. So bridges like in transportation, right? Cars, trucks, or I guess here, I'm sorry, lorries, or even railroad bridges. And the reason why that matters goes to something that Keith talked about, IPRs, because within IPRs, we think of essential facilities, right? A bridge matters because there's no other bridge within 1,000 kilometers, and therefore we need to provide access to competitors. The thing is, in a technologically savvy world, these kinds of arguments don't hold in the way they do for traditional infrastructure-related industries, and that's what I'll talk about. So competition law has looked, to a certain extent, at some of what trade law has done, such as our Article 40 of TRIPS, and think, do we have essential facilities as well that we need to protect? What happens when there's entry? So a number of potential possibilities, right? Lower prices, better quality, more innovation, ideally all of the three. And the question is, do we see something different, right, that prevents entry with regard to traditional regulated industries? Well, there we tend to have natural monopolies, and we also tend to have a history of either state-owned enterprises or now privatized or partially privatized state-owned enterprises. And they simply, I would suggest, work differently, but people like to impose existing frameworks on new technologies. And the real concern we have is what happens if these new technologies are somehow stymied as a result of the wrong sort of regulation. So I'll start with the United States and then see if there are any lessons that we can have learned for India. So the lesson of the United States is it took us a long time to get to the right outcome. And the right outcome is we should listen to economists, so Chirantan is happy. So our Supreme Court in the United States normally believes in something called stare decisis, that we look at precedent to guide where we're going in the future. Well, competition law in the States, as you see from this quote, Kimball v. Marvel Entertainment literally is a case involving Spider-Man. I mean, really it is. And so Spider-Man can do no wrong. And here, what our Supreme Court tells us is actually we don't really believe in precedent the same way in competition law. And the reason for that is where we have emerging economic consensus of how markets work, we're going to listen to the economists. And that's what's going to shape the law. So economic effects ultimately in the United States really matter. Now this is a very modern view because in fact, for a long time in the United States, we had exactly the opposite view. We had a more populist style approach, which is exactly at the time to try to draw some kind of causal link. How causal? Unclear, it's difficult to measure. But we know that in the 60s and 70s, when the United States was most aggressive its enforcement, where it was not based on what we think of as modern economic analysis, we chilled a lot of efficient behavior with regard to mergers. We chilled a lot of behavior with regard to just vertical contracting more generally. We went after large companies simply because they were large. What we didn't focus on was efficiency. And this change took a while. It took a while in academic circles. It took a while in front of our authorities. It took a while within the courts. But I think we're in a happy place now because apparently we listened to Spider-Man. So it turns out increasingly we have this effects-based approach around the world. Again, case involving patent, IP rather, focuses, Kimball says that economic effects matters. It's the most recent Supreme Court case, but frankly, all the Supreme Court cases in competition law have been about how economic effects matter. Europe, the Intel case really solidifies, I think, going forward, that at the judicial level, economic effects matter. And what it really does is it really puts in a judicial context what the regulator, DG Competition, been saying at least since the early 2000s, that they're driven by consumer welfare. We see this in a bunch of other settings around the world, in common law jurisdictions, even civil law jurisdictions that talk about how ultimately what we care are the economic effects. This is the global standard. And in fact, last week here in Delhi, competition authorities from around the world came together for their annual meeting, and I think this ultimately came out that whatever else is going on within popular circles in the news, what seems to matter for regulation of competition is economic effects. So I'll talk about two things. One are online markets generally, and the second would be IPRs. Both, in a sense, suffer from broader populist concern. The problem that we tend to find is people say, well, these companies are big and they're making money, and somehow this concern with bigness and a sense that we should be morally offended that companies make money seems to, I know it's weird in a business school setting that people would be morally offended, but nevertheless, the popular press around the world focuses on these kinds of issues. And so when they say like, well, we're really concerned about all kinds of fill in the blank shit is somehow being exploited, what they really say is big is bad, and profit making is bad. So it turns out that profit making is a good thing. And here's where it really comes into play. Number one, going to building bridges, we need to build more bridges because most of the time, within this field at least, we actually don't understand the underlying technology. That is, our government regulators around the world really don't have a sense of how these markets work. So, say within a strategy context, this is what we call ultimately non-market-based strategy. So part of what you need to do as a business person is to actually go in and explain to your regulators, this is how our technology works. Because unless they understand the technology, unless they understand what the business implications are, they can't actually figure out whether the law requires some sort of intervention or no intervention. And this is the real value add of building bridges across disciplines, right? So unless we have legal theories that actually match up to economic effects, and unless the economic effects are actually based on an understanding of technology, we've got a real problem. Because what we end up doing is we end up stymieing innovation. And that's the big takeaway that I have for you. So if we start, say, with big data, which is scary because it involves two scary words. Number one, big, and number two, data. So there are all kinds of reasons why we use data and why we use it competitively, right? There are all kinds of free services we get. Some of you would say, not so fast. It's not all free. There are certain trade-offs. That's true. But we willingly make these trade-offs because the value add, the efficient outcomes from this actually exceed any other concerns that we have, right? Oftentimes, we have low barriers to entry. So what's the difference between one app and another app? You know, oftentimes, just a change in an idea. So it turns out that in many cases, data is going to be ubiquitous, inexpensive, and easy to collect. It's not so much that you can collect data, right? It's not like hoarding cash or gold, right? Data has a limited shelf life, kind of like yogurt. But for our purposes, what matters is not data, but what you do with the data. So let's imagine we're a company. We probably see this in all kinds of case studies, regardless of what particular discipline you're in, or if you're in business. You have all kinds of deals that just didn't go well. You wonder, where were the synergies in these deals, right? So let me walk you through one of the problems. We think, like, where should the synergies be immediately, right? Think about IT infrastructure, right? We have two companies. Oh, my God, we're just going to put these two companies together. We'll have data on one side and data on the other side. It's going to work out great, right? Think of your traditional vertical acquisition. And then here's what happens. You actually close the deal. You get your deal teams, your post-integration deal teams together and say, great, show us the data. And what you realize is that the data has been structured in very different ways. So then you get some of Gopi's former colleagues at GE trained in Six Sigma to try to optimize this data. And tens of millions of dollars later, 2 years later, you realize actually the data doesn't talk to each other in any kind of meaningful way. And at that point, frankly, the data's gone stale. Because if it was really easy to create synergies with data, merger control would be really easy. We would just stamp everything, you know, efficient. It can go through. Why? Because the data, you know, the data synergies alone would be enough to overcome any combined market power and any combined anti-competitive concern that we would have. That's just not how the world works, unfortunately. it turns out that data is highly differentiated, right? And so one lesson that we have is data is highly differentiated actually across different platforms. So when we acquire other companies, or when companies are competing, they're not actually all using the same kinds of data. Sometimes we have structured data, sometimes we have unstructured data, sometimes structured different ways. I don't have to tell this to people who actually are engineering savvy. Welcome to coming to India. There are potential anti-competitive problems. I'm not trying to say that these don't exist. What I am going to tell you, however, that in every single tech-related merger that we've had, the concerns about big data have not outweighed any kind of potential efficiencies that we've seen, at least in terms of the cases thus far. So that's the message. So when we hear concern that somehow we should have forced sharing, the answer would be, based on what? We haven't seen that in any of the cases. So let me have some qualifications here. When we heard this from Gita Guri earlier, market definition is complex. Particularly when we're talking about multi-sided markets. We have multi-homing. It turns out if we look even from the strategic management literature, think particularly at resource-based theories, it turns out the data is only as good as what you do with it. So I can give you any number of examples, but if I can, I'd like to talk about one of my favorite. I met my wife the old-fashioned way. So again, it's a, I wouldn't say arranged marriage. What I would say is simply two lawyers from the US Federal Trade Commission set us up on a blind date. Turned out it was on Valentine's Day, but when you're not dating, you don't really realize it's Valentine's Day until you have to make a reservation for a restaurant, and you realize, why is no reservation available until 10 p.m.? What matters is that we have 3 beautiful children. We call those dynamic efficiencies, okay? So it turns out when dating went online, again, matchmaking just moved from offline to online. There were plenty of online dating platforms in the United States. But one, even though it had, when it got started, far less data than all the others had been around for at least a decade, seemed to do really well. And it's a platform, I don't know if it's popular in India. It is apparently in the States, particularly with my students, something called Tinder. And Tinder became very popular, not because it had more data, but because it had a binary approach. Yes, no. One of them is swipe left, the other is swipe right, and I always seem to get it wrong, which shows you that I haven't been on, because I haven't been on a date with anyone since 2002. But I understand from my students, it really made dating easy. So again, this is a situation where it's not the data that matters, it's what you do with it. Swipe left, swipe right. Now, it also turns out that we seem to be inordinately fixated in the United States. In India, it's a slightly different cast of characters, but in the United States, we're fixated with a number of companies, all of whom seem to be online platforms, all of whom seem to be end consumer platforms. But if you actually look at where the data scientists are being hired, it's actually a very different world. There are far more people in finance than all of the large US tech platforms on the consumer side combined. And yet the fixation is on our consumer platforms, which suggests to me, again, big is scary, data is scary, but it's that combination on the consumer side that seems to scare us most. So I'm going to quickly talk about conduct cases. We haven't seen big data come up there as a theory of harm that actually creates actual harm in the States. We haven't seen any such cases at DG Competition. As of yet, we haven't seen any from CCI either, but the reason I raised data is because the chairman talked about big data just last week. So I actually want to talk about more traditional things, because in IPRs, we also have these kinds of concerns of when do you have to have force sharing, particularly for patents. We see this in China, that the guidelines that the Chinese authorities have, which says IP are essential facilities. I'd say, hold on. I'd say there are certain cases of refusals to deal, and I can walk you through those. But when we're thinking of IP, and it seems in the Chinese context, patents in particular, a lot in the ITC sector, what they seem to really be concerned with is actually a single firm. And so in the United States, we get the sense from the Supreme Court that they don't buy this, that there is no essential facilities doctrine, suggesting that actually you need to have a pre-existing relationship. And we also have hostility for our legal treatise. Now, the reason why this matters is because I think there are reasons why we might require access. But if you look at the classic cases, this is not patents, right? What you learn both in business schools and engineering departments is how do we basically work around the patent? Well, if you can work around the patent fairly easily, it means it's not essential. But this is now, I think, one of the big divides that we have. We have a group of demanders of saying, we need to have forced sharing without thinking through what the long-term implications are. And here's what, when we have a very aggressive doctrine of forced sharing, it creates legal uncertainty. Why invest when the fruits of your investment will be taken away? And even worse, shared with all your competitors. But in fact, we're seeing this in two very important areas. One is big data, and the second is IPRs. And if we're not careful, all the wonderful innovations that are happening in India may be chilled by over-aggressive enforcement. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. We all got swayed for a moment. But as you can see, we are trying to cover a span of areas in short speeches, and obviously it's these are like bodies of work or decades of scholarship of each one of the experts on the panel. But all of this also takes us back to the fundamental issue, which is innovation towards what end? Does innovation have distributional consequences? So on that vein, let me hand it over for Shubhashis, who has worn the hat of a development economist, to talk a little bit about innovation and inequality. And I know we have given you the onerous burden to wrap up, so you hopefully will keep all of us humored.
Thank you. Thank you. I will begin with apologizing for being just the last speaker before your orders, right? But it's not my fault. That is how Chirantan had planned it. This topic, when he gave to me, reminded me of my high school and early college days when I used to debate, right? And one of the things that you often had to do in those debates in Calcutta is that you walked in without knowing what the motion was and on which side you were speaking. So this was like this when he asked me to speak on innovation and inequality, because I had no clue what I was going to say. But unlike a debate, I had more time. So the thing that the point that I want to make on this, I know that there is a lot of talk on innovation. It's quite fashionable in India and the world. And similarly in India and the world, it's very fashionable to talk about inequality too. And it's not surprising that therefore that topic has to be looked at, right? Innovation and inequality. But I want to make the point, hopefully, I'll be successful in making that point, that trying to find a causal link, either between innovation and inequality or between inequality and innovation, right, is similar to butterflies fluttering causing nuclear holocaust. Right? I seriously think so. I think these are extremely different things. Right? There are instances, and that's what I'm going to argue, there are instances where clearly innovation is necessary, often essential for getting rid of inequality, and at other times when we talk about inequality as I shouldn't say essential, as necessary for creating innovation, we are talking of a very particular setup, and there are alternative setups where you can create innovation without inequality, right? So, so it's a very complicated thing. So I'm going to try and sift through this thing simply because I do not want a plethora of research in India going towards inequality and innovation. Because I remember this when we, post-91, when we started the reform process, by the mid-90s, there was such a huge research effort put in to argue that it is this reform process that is creating huge inequalities in India. Right? And a lot of good time and effort was spent on this. Now we have given that up. I do not want it to start again with innovation. Now, when we talk of innovation, to me, the reason why I think it has, if at all, very little connection with inequality is because I would think that if I look at most of the innovative activities, it's usually a local issue or a local problem. Observe that I don't say only a local problem, it could also be a local issue, because oftentimes an innovation actually creates an entirely new market which nobody even thought about. Right? So that's why I say a local issue, but it's usually in the immediate neighborhood, and that neighborhood in a global world is obviously much larger than a neighborhood in a very localized world that we had before. But the important point that I'm trying to make here is that it involves scale. For an innovation to be really, really effective, it has to have scale. And the moment you have scale, right, it is very difficult to talk about inequality, at least in consumption. And for India, that is very, very important, because in India, all the data that we have on inequality only involves consumption. We have no income data, and hence we don't have any income inequality data, right? And that's the reason why it's important to understand that the one thing that so-called innovation should be addressing is something that gets rid of consumption inequality. And that we see in almost everything that we would sit back and say was a very innovative idea, regardless of where it happened, whether in India or abroad. Right? So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that, as I said, if we look at some of the innovations that have taken place, and throughout the day you have heard various instances, right? Even in this session, you heard various instances of what the Tatas are trying to do. And in many of those, if they're successful, I'm sure they would be, right? If you step back and think, that actually helps the ordinary consumer. And anything that helps a large chunk of consumers in being able to attain whatever they're trying to attain, in a sense, the quality of life, then clearly it's an inclusive innovation. Talk of health, right? We heard a lot about health. Talk of education, online education, you know, ISB, how many faculty members do you have? 8 or 10, teaching 800, you know, makes no sense, right? When we have 1.3 billion, largest young population in the world and growing, who have to be trained and educated. Right? So we use technology. How can we say that it causes inequality? I have no clue. Right? Even if I try, an economist, you know, can say on both sides, right? But even this one I cannot say. I cannot find any economic reasoning to be able to argue, right, that when it comes to things like health, education, provision of government services, right, that any innovative process, they may be successful, they may be unsuccessful. That's a different matter. But certainly an innovation that is successful, that is caught on, cannot increase inequality, right? In these three aspects at least. That I think it's very extremely difficult. Now, the one distinction that I would want to make, and this I'll now get a little bit nuanced in what I was saying, is I would like to make a distinction, because what I would call, for want of a better term, business innovation or service delivery innovation and actual product innovation, right? So much of what was being talked about by Gopi was essentially, you know, it was bringing product and services together, of course, because now it's very difficult to think about a car, as you correctly said, right? But still, I think in our minds we should distinguish between what is a clear service innovation and or business innovation and what is a product innovation. The reason why I want to make this distinction is again because of our legacy, which is that till about, I'm very happy that we don't hear it anymore, but till about 5-6 years ago, there was such an euphoria about jugaad in India. Right? I'm very happy to know that we have gone beyond that. We are no longer talking of jugaad in India, because I think that was the worst possible escapism that we could do instead of innovating. Right? So that's the reason why I want to distinguish, because much of the service innovation or business innovations that we talk about is essentially a very sophisticated form of jugaad that we are doing. This is not to say that no service innovation is happening, but I'm just saying that if we keep this distinction in our mind, we'll be able to really sift through the innovation process a lot better. The reason why I make this distinction is because if I look at the business innovations, right, there are a lot of disruptive processes that take place in a business innovation, most particularly for the type of labor requirements or the employment market that we generate in India at least. Right? So that's the reason why I would like to look at it differently from product innovation. What do I mean by that? Let's take the obvious example, Uber, right? Has it improved consumption, quality of that service? Of course it has, no question. So it is inclusive in that sense. Many more people can travel much more easily than they were doing before. And by many more, I don't mean that this very rich persons are traveling a lot more than before. No, no, no. They are probably still in their cars. It's a person who didn't have a car and hence didn't go to many places is now able to do that. And it is especially true when it comes to things like commuting to work, because I'm in Gurgaon, so I know that this is a huge service for people who commute to work and don't keep regular time, so can't use a chartered bus, can't take the office transportation and all of that. Right? So it's a huge, in that sense, good thing. But now let me look at the side of those who are providing these services. Right? And there is where the problem lies. Right? And I'm not going to delve into them, you can understand, because essentially what is happening is that earlier I was a taxi driver, there was a taxi stand, right? And I was a driver there, I did trips, I got paid. Today I have to bring my own car to be able to run Uber. So I, as somebody who is using my labor to earn income, also have to bring my tool along with me, like in olden days, right? So the laborer is bringing the tool to the job place, which essentially means in a capitalist setup, much of the residual capital, the risk, right, is being borne by the laborer. And that has efficiency considerations. It also has a very, very serious issue, which is that of human capital development. Because when we talk about innovation, and many of the innovations that we are discussing throughout the day today really require high investments in human capital and a highly knowledge-based society. Now in that context, I think there are issues to look at. But outside of that, I could not find any causal link, right, that I could draw. No theory of change, right? No causal link that I could draw between innovation and inequality, excepting that it creates a labor market that could give rise, if we are not careful, to disruptions and hence inequality. But this is not an issue of innovation. This thing that I'm talking about, as economists, we should be aware of and start looking into it, but this is essentially a policy issue. Any technological change, right, worth its salt, will create disruption. This is like saying that if I start producing, hybrid cars, or if I start producing a form of public transportation that doesn't involve everyone early in the morning getting into their car, big car, nowadays we have big cars, right, diesel fuel big cars, traveling all the way from Gurgaon to Delhi with one passenger, namely the driver who is going to office, parking the car, taking up space and then driving back. Now we know good technology should be able to generate public transportation such that this doesn't happen. Now many of these big cars also have drivers, right? Now clearly their jobs would be at stake. It will create disruption. So there is no way that a disruptive technology or a disruptive innovation will not create, for some sectors, for some people already employed in the earlier sectors, those which are becoming obsolete, to be affected. But this is how the world progresses, and this is where public policy comes in, right? So you retool, you create safety nets, whatever you need to do. You cannot stop innovation, even in this causal link. Even if I can show that because of Uber, the erstwhile taxi drivers are in serious trouble, even then I cannot say hence innovation is the culprit or the thing to rein in. Right? That is why we have public policy, that is why we have collective action. Right? And that is where we should be focusing when we talk of inequality. Now the reason why I raise this point is because we have done a lot of work in our institute and with some of my colleagues on the labor market situation in India, right? Throughout the world, people say that employment is not getting generated, and hence Hence, income is not getting distributed, right, in the way that we would like it to be. And hence, we started looking at the labor market, and in the labor market you hear a lot, and if there are businesses here, they will tell you, they will keep telling you that there is a skill gap. Now, as an economist, when somebody says there is a skill gap, I expect to see wages of skilled labor improving over time. I don't see that. So, I don't understand what this skill gap context is. So, therefore, we started looking into the labor market, and we found some things quite amazing. The one thing that I am going to say here about where I think the problem lies, and that is where we should focus when we talk about innovation, is that we need skilled labor. Unfortunately, the only skilled labor that is getting hired is at the high end. Right? So, today if you are looking for a big data analyst, you will probably get one. And it will probably be cheaper to hire that big data analyst in India than in the United States. But if you are looking for somebody who will work in any product, any production process, you will not find any skilled labor. Now, the question is, why is that skilled labor not therefore being demanded at a higher wage? And that is the thing that we are working on, and we find that there are various policies that actually allow only people who have the wherewithal, given that our education sector is becoming more and more privatized, starting from the basic school level, that the only way, right, that people can move up the skill ladder is if you are planning to get to the highest skill. Otherwise, it makes no sense. So, you drop out by the time you are in class 8 and 10, and then you can't work in the industry, because every single, we have this plan or this project that we are doing, which is killing 1 million women, and in the process we find that be it male, be it female, you cannot get a formal sector job without school education. But 50% of the people drop out before finishing class 8, forget about even secondary schooling. So, that mismatch has to be addressed. That is why we have this inequality. It has nothing to do with innovation. Innovation has aggravated a process, right, that was already bad, that is all. You cannot say that innovation is causing it. All that it tells us is how to address this problem. It has probably poked us in the eye. That is all that innovation has done when it comes to the Indian setup, I would say. I will stop there. Thank you.
In the interest of keeping it efficient, since I share the dais with economists and economically minded speakers, let us go over to questions. I do not have any particular summary to provide. As you can realize, there is an international economics component to it. There is a global conglomerate and its innovative approach to exploit innovation in today's economy approach to it. Legal scholars have to say something about competition law, and then the social panel has to think about it in a more nuanced way. So, let us take some questions and wrap up this panel. Yes, please. Kailash.
I'd like each of the panelists to respond to the proposition that it's very popular nowadays that data is the new oil, and that data is electricity to the 21st century and what electricity was to the 20th century. So if each one of you could respond to that. I think it's been there's some contentions on that topic, so it would be great to get your perspectives.
Maybe you can start with Gopi, because he was talking about big data.
I think, of course, data has a lot of value, and it should be looked at from that perspective. There are differences between oil and data, which is quite obvious. Oil is, you can look at it as one commodity and price it in one way, and data, depending on the where it will be put to use and for what it will be put to use, it can take different value and can be looked at in different ways. So I think it's important to know that data has value, and it is important to know that data is different than oil.
Okay, Keith, you want to share your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I largely agree. Data has great value. I don't know if you've seen the numbers, but as of a couple of years ago, Google was getting something like $45 per user in advertising revenue. If you think about the size of that pool, it's extraordinary. So you can see why there's so much interest in trying to be able to get access to these data or use data or collect it and sell it. All I would say about it is we've entered a period where the world and its major constituencies has to figure out exactly what it means to have what I would consider something like an essential facility, which is data, and how do you regulate its use? I mean, this is a very big question. The United States has taken quite a different approach to this, the European community, and this is the sort of central trade issue of the day between those two. So it's going to be quite interesting to work through.
Danny?
There's not much more that I could add that I didn't already say earlier or that we just haven't heard. The one thing that I would say in terms of caution, most companies don't actually use, or you might even say exploit, most of their data. You take a large company like an Amazon, they're not using for any given function more than 1% of their data. At a certain point, it's not like oil where like by hoarding the data, you can somehow affect price or even for a company's perspective, profit, right? That there are only limited uses for the data, and even the way that companies structured, they don't even share data within the company so easy. A lot of times when you make an acquisition, you want to leave the acquired company almost as a separate company in many ways. And so if companies aren't using the data, either something's wrong with the companies, or alternatively, as much as we think that data matters, it could be that there are other aspects at play that matter a lot more than the data does. This is not to take away from Keith's point that data matters. Clearly is very important, but how each company gets competitive strategy is really a function of their ability given their data needs and what they can do at a given moment of time.
Shubhashis?
Yeah, the data obviously has value. I think the real issue now is the extraction of that value has become more possible, because whatever is floating around out there was there all the time, right? Now we have digitized it, and we now know how to get value out of it, or how to extract the value. The value was always there. I would like to make the following point, though, that especially as a social scientist, right? Now, there are people here from the business school, so I'm sorry I'm giving this example because I'm sure you have heard this, that you go to a market to see if you can sell shoes. Two people go, they look at the same market, they collect the same data, and they come back. One person says that there are no market for shoes. The other person says there is a huge market for shoes. Why? Because both have seen that there are people there going barefoot. Now, what is the value of this observation? It depends on the theory you have behind it, right? You observe the same thing, but coming to completely different inferences. And that's what generates the value, not the data itself, but what inference you draw. And given that people are strategic, they are not natural particles that, the more data you have, the more you can predict a pattern and all of that. The moment people whose data you're collecting, especially in this big data setup, the more people's data you're collecting, and they're aware of it, right, there would be responses. So unless you can, keep that in mind, right, I don't think we'll be able to extract the full value of the data. But data is obviously valuable.
Excellent. Maybe a couple more questions and we'll wrap up. Okay. I'll take Rima first and then come to you.
I had a question on skilling, right? We were talking a little bit about skilling and innovation and how, there's different dimensions to each one of them. And the question is, from skilling perspective, you just mentioned that there's this huge dichotomy in terms of there's higher end skills that are in big demand, but then the lower end skills, and there are a lot of people with lower end skills. And the question is, how can our education sector innovate to be able to address that? And is there some ideas among any of the panelists or any things you are exploring that you feel can help bridge that gap? Because that gap is there and is going to grow in India, and what can we do?
Looks like everyone wants to take that.
Okay. Another conference on this subject.
So Tata Strive is an example where we're looking at skilling large populations, large sections of our population. When we are talking about skilling, we have to look at we have to add a minimum of 100 million jobs in the next decade. I've heard numbers as high as 500 million jobs. And other piece of information is that 80% of the workforce will be new in 10 years. That's also because today only 40% of the eligible workforce is participating in India. So given all this, you cannot say that we'll create jobs only with big data analysis or with biomedical engineering or things like that. So you need to create this layer of, I would say, almost diploma holders, people who are skilled at various aspects of, maybe technology, maybe hospitality, so many other areas. So that is the effort we are undertaking under the National Skills Development Program. It's Tata Stride.
Danny, you want to say anything?
We have similar problems in the United States. With similar type debates, I don't think that there are easy answers. What I would say in the United States, we have underemphasized vocational training, and in areas where, as we have a more aging population, that it's going to matter more, like just healthcare provision. We just, that's an easy area that can lift people up to another level. The other thing that complicates it for us is simply, for a large country, we now have less labor mobility than we've had, which is really weird, right? Transportation is much easier now, and yet people don't want to leave where they live to where the jobs are. And until I think we solve that, we can't solve the education problem either. We could educate them, and yet they don't leave.
Shubhashis, since you raised the skill issue.
Just quickly, first, it will not be solved so quickly. You will need at least one generation to solve it. So when we are trying to plan for it, we must keep this thing in mind, right? We cannot solve it tomorrow, we cannot solve it in a decade actually. But if we plan for a generation of 15 years, say, we will be able to target that way. That's the first observation. The second observation is that there are various, since everything is privatized in India, especially when it comes to education and skill. Tata, by the way, we have worked with Tata Strive on this skilling 1 million women. So the problem is that when I'm investing in skilling myself or educating myself, right, I'm worried about what will be the return and how much do I spend. Unfortunately, everything that affects wages do not take this into account. For example, the recent policy on wage subsidization doesn't take this into account. Reducing costs of training have a much better impact than increasing wages, especially at the lower end, right? Like Narega, for example, is a problem in that sense. It's a great solution to somebody who doesn't have a steady income. But if I'm trying to solve the skill thing, for example, when Narega first came out, we got it down, we made everybody agree that if, however, you're skilling yourself instead, then also you'll get the money. And when the notification came out, that was dutifully removed, right? So that's the problem. You have to understand what is it that we want to solve. It doesn't require rocket science, but it does require careful mapping of where we want to go and where we are and how are we going to get there, right? So that's all.
If I can add, it's also a question of ensuring that the pride and aspirations are in the correct place. So today, for example, if you're a very poorly trained big data analyst, you're not going to get a job. There are enough of them who are good. But if you're a good plumber, you will make more money than that poorly trained data analyst. So this realization has not set in.
Excellent. I think if Anirudh permits, we can have your question offline. And that's a good way to end the conversation. So thank you everyone. We are really running late. We really appreciate your patience with us. We have a little bit of final words from Anand, my colleague, and also my Dean Raj. So we'll wrap up with that, and I'll give a quick vote of thanks after that.
I'm not going to take too much time since we are running late. We had a very enriching 1.5 days, I must say. Lots of insights. One thing maybe that's a common denominator is that, laws surrounding innovation, assuming that innovation is not for innovation itself, but for other larger purposes, is laws around it and regulating it is in fact complicated simply because of maybe certain set of idiosyncratic reasons surrounding India. For example, the existence of formal versus the informal ecosystem that in itself presents a conundrum, right? In some ways, maybe the formal ecosystem requires IPRs, the need for monopoly power so that it can be licensed to somebody else, so that it can eventually become a product or a service, versus maybe the informal economy that also, informal ecosystem, sorry, which also requires some sort of sharing just for creating these ideas itself. So that maybe is one of the conundrums that contributes to this complexity. And maybe there's a general conundrum in terms of regulating innovation itself, simply because there is this trade-off between competition, the effects of providing monopoly power, which reduces competition, and hence there is this intersection between the competitiveness of markets, provided we can define it very well, and the need for incentivizing or providing long-run incentives for innovation itself. And this is a topic that's just not idiosyncratic to India alone, which has been debated for at least the last few decades. And of course, the other topic that resonated among the panelists was also this idea that how do you incentivize innovations that, especially the type of innovations that maybe India has a relative comparative advantage in generating, such as process innovations, maybe business model innovations. And of course, there were a slew of issues around just the heterogeneity, right? Heterogeneity between markets or industries. Once again, markets, provided they can be defined. Market definition seems to be an issue, depending on the level of the country's development, right? So does India, which is still developing in many areas, require maybe the set of laws which, for example, the United States actually has? Should, for example, harmonizing IP itself across the world, given that different countries are in different stages of development itself, is a good idea or not? For example, maybe one of the points that came up during this session was perhaps should we leave it to these PTAs, which are essentially organized by sectors, relative to having like one single law that regulates and even harmonizes intellectual property across the world. How should a firm, one thing that definitely came up in the case of Tata's is the fact that how should a firm think about intellectual property protection, especially if it is operating in different sectors, different markets, catering to maybe people in different sectors, like producing a car versus something else altogether, right? And of course, the other idea around heterogeneity that came about is how do you even go about regulating innovation or incentivizing innovation using these IPR-like legal paradigms when technology itself is evolving, right? I mean, when the industry itself is evolving, maybe there has to be different types of laws as these industries evolve itself. When should governments intervene versus not? At which stage of the evolution of an industry? And of course, there was a lot of discussion around enforcement issues as well. For one thought, maybe a provocative thought, is whether maybe on the contrary, enforcement should be harmonized as well. Hard to do, but maybe one question could be, should enforcement itself also be harmonized the world over across industries, going to the other end of the spectrum? And of course, the idea is also not only to have these laws simply to having for the purposes of having them, but these laws or policymakers perhaps need to understand the underlying nature of the technology itself, and there needs to be a good interaction between policy and technology, and also in order to aid commercialization of these technologies as well. So in essence, what this conference, not competition, I was getting a bit carried away, of course. What this conference actually tells us is the fact that this is a very, very complicated topic. This is certainly a good start in the direction, but perhaps more such conversations and maybe research itself around some of these areas, especially those topics that are idiosyncratic to this context. There needs to be more data that should be put to test and more insights, that empirical insights that should be derived, and that could perhaps be some done using the sort of cooperation between different sets of participants right in this room, folks from the industry, policy, academics like us, and maybe how people could slice and dice this sort of complex issue and hopefully find answers to some of these issues, and maybe get data to drive a set of policies and understand the consequences of policy. So as a true, I don't know if it is a true or an untrue academic, but as an academic, maybe this sort of complexity calls for more insights itself being developed around these areas, especially those that can sort of derive from some of the work that has happened elsewhere, but nonetheless look at some of the idiosyncratic elements that drive the innovation ecosystem in India. All right, so that's how I'm going to end it. And of course, I'm going to give you a little bit of spiel about the Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship at ISB. And one of the reasons that the center exists is to do this kind of research and also to take it to the classroom and train managers as well. So it's that kind of a virtuous cycle. So we are happy to cooperate with anybody who's willing to help us in that effort. So with that, I'll thank you everybody and it's been, at least for me, a lot of fun being in this conference. Thanks.
Thank you, Anand.
Now, before I pass it on to our dean, I would like to request Professor Chirantan to facilitate our guests who have been panelists. So I'd like to give this token of appreciation to Gopichand Katragadda.
Thank you. Thank you, Gopi.
Thank you. Professor Keith Maskus.
Thank you, Keith.
Professor Daniel Sokol.
Thank you, Daniel.
Shubhashis Gangopadhyay.
Thanks, Shubhashis.
And I'll request Professor Maskus to give Professor Chirantan Chatterjee the token of appreciation for panel moderation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, sir. Thank you. Group picture.
Thank you so much. It's been a fantastic day of fascinating conversations and a lot of insights and key takeaways. Now I invite our dean to wrap up and talk about the way forward and how you can engage with ISB. So our Dean Rajendra Srivastava.
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate all of you who are still in the room for staying power. And so we have a saying at ISB that no good deed shall go unpunished. And we've had a very healthy conversation today. I have been on the road, and I was very, very pleasantly surprised with the number of people who have attended this meeting. And it represented, the academics, people from industry, the associations, and the lawyers. And I think, what we need to do is to figure out a roadmap in terms of where do we go from here. It's a good start, but then the question is, what do we do with it? So one of the things I'm volunteering the ISB faculty who've been involved in this is to see if we can create at least 2 reports. There will be overlapping reports, but one needs to go to the Ministry for Commerce and Industry, and we'll meet the minister. And the other needs to go to NITI. And so we will work on that, and for those of you who've been involved in it and helping create this content for this conference, we'll share it with you before we present it to the two entities. For the speakers, we would also request you if we can share your presentations with the audience, and we'll put it on our website. So those of you who are able to do that, that would be a wonderful, sharing. So it'll be a little bit of uploading that Anil was talking about. And so we want to do that. I want to think of what do we do to take this forward a little bit. So perhaps the people who are here and were here, if we could look at this as a innovation, intellectual property, and competition work group. And if you have colleagues who are interested in this area who couldn't be here but who would like to be involved in it, please send us, please connect us to them through email, and we will add them to the work group. And what I hope will happen over a period of time is we need to work towards a second such meeting. It took a lot of work and to get this meeting going. It may take maybe another 6 months to get the second meeting going. But hopefully after that, once we get organized and once we're able to curate the issues, the questions that need to be answered, we can do it in a quarterly fashion if we can set up this group. And my hope is that we can anchor it at the Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. But I would like the meetings to be not necessarily at ISB. Perhaps CSIR, which was present here, could host it in Delhi next time. We'd like to find a partner in Mumbai, a partner in Bangalore, and we could host it in Hyderabad. And that'll cover the 4 major metro areas, within India. So we'll see if we can get this thing going. We'll also try to put up a website where we can share, information coming in. So at least a portal for issues as they are affecting, things in India. So these are 2 things, maybe at least a second meeting to be then followed up with a quarterly meeting, and then a website that caters to these topics that we were discussing today. I'm very fond of an organization called the Marketing Science Institute. It's based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And MSI has been a bit of a broker between industry and academia. And they've got about 85 member companies. And these member companies, as well as senior academics, form a very, very large board of trustees, if you will. And these trustees get together on an annual basis. They have a 2-day annual conference. And the trustees, through discussion, come up with the research priorities. These research priorities are then disseminated globally. And I think in this case, since we're talking about intellectual property and competition, it is a global issue, although the discussion today was focused on what do we do about it in India. So hopefully we can get something like the MSI model going. And in that, of course, MSI is just industry and academia. In this case, we need to include the government. We also need to include the associations like NASSCOM, USIBC, and so on and so forth. So I think we've got a healthy mix. The topic that we're talking about is also going to need the inclusion of the legal community in it. And so we will have to reach out to more law firms that are involved in this area. But I can see us, we have a word for all this in Hindi called khichdi. We'll put all this thing together and cook it up together and see what's the progress that we can make. We've been talking a lot about data and the insights that one can get from data, but I'm afraid that data is not going to be enough to look at the problems and the issues and the hurdles that need to be passed. So we're going to have to be perhaps a little bit proactive as well. So while we analyze the data, we should also be looking for solutions as to, these hurdles are there. And because a lot of things that are happening today, the importance of ecosystems, how quickly information moves, these are not things that have necessarily occurred, even as recently as 10 years ago. So we're going to have to be a little bit forward-looking, and I hope this group that we can get it together will get that moving. So with that, we will be sending everybody who attended an email, and we'll show you the link, for the presentations. We will also share the 2 papers that I mentioned that we're going to take to NITI and to the Ministry for Commerce and Industry. Those will also be shared with you. And so, we look forward to working, with you, and we hope to see you again. And should I?
Request you help to recognize our sponsors as well for the event.
Okay.
So I'd like to invite people from Qualcomm to come, please. The US Chamber of Commerce. GIPC, Global Innovation Policy Center. Himal is gone probably. Thank you so much. Sure. US-India Business Council.
Thank you.
We'd like to invite Mint, our media partners. Is there someone outside from them? Oh, no. It's okay. And Crick. It's okay. I'd like to invite Professor Chirantan Chatterjee to just give the vote of thanks and close the conference.
Since you have endured us so much, 5 more minutes, please. This conference would not have been possible without the silent passion that one has witnessed over the last 6 months, planning for the conference of many, many co-workers and colleagues of mine at ISB. So while it has been an intense day, let me just enlist them and thank them for all the work that has been done. First of all, of course, we are very much indebted to our partners and our sponsors, Qualcomm, USIBC, GIPC, US Chambers of Commerce, and LiveMint for supporting in planning and making this conference happen. Both the Hyderabad campus and the Mohali campus of ISB are key cogs in the wheel in the local innovation system, and there we have something like the RICH in Telangana region and the Chandigarh Region Innovation and Knowledge Cluster, which is a consortium of healthcare research organizations. They have been very helpful with their inputs and thoughts and partnership. We acknowledge Niti Aayog for providing various inputs at various stages of this conference. A special word of acknowledgement, while they could not make it by themselves, for Minister Suresh Prabhu, Madam Aruna Sundararajan, Dr. Girish Sahni, and Dr. Anil Gupta for joining us from the government side. Gratefulness also to a bunch of our overseas speakers. Some of you who might be following our schedule would have seen that a couple of speakers could not make it due to health exigencies. Professor Stephen Haber from Stanford University and Professor Dietmar Harhoff from Max Planck Institute in Germany. But the good news is, while we have stretched this much today evening, we have recorded videos from them. So we'll upload that on the website that my dean was talking about, and you can take a look at their thoughts. But beyond that, those who could come in the middle of a semester, Rahul, Danny, and Keith, while leaving their teaching obligations, and now they'll go back by the weekend. It has been a hectic trip. Thank you so much for making it over. This is also the time to thank all our other speakers who themselves are extremely busy in their daily professional lives to spare time for the conference. ISB faculty members who have mentored us as part of the conference committee, Dean Raj and Professor Anand Nandkumar has been extremely supportive. And of course, our entire mentoring committee from the ISB faculty side has been very helpful. Mr. Madhav Lal from the Bharti Institute of Public Policy has provided his inputs. Ms. Aruna Reddy from the Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship has provided her inputs. They are our key centers at ISB who are our partners for this conference. Several departmental colleagues, and I do want to emphasize and take a minute to mention their names, have helped us. Mr. Ravindra Harlekar, our Chief Finance Officer, Mr. Rajiv Bhargava from the Commercial Department, Mr. Sanjay Singh, Mr. Debananda Mishra, Mr. Indira Vemuru, and Ms. Niranjana from various departments of ISB, Office of Alumni Relations, etc., have contributed in making this conference happen. And last but not the least, I want to thank my core team Ms. Bharti Satyanarayana, Mr. T.A.V. Srinivasa, CLMP Director, and also my colleague, Ms. Rima Gupta. And he couldn't be there, but he was very instrumental. Mr. Kumaraguru, Director of External Relations, and his team, Sandeep, Prashant, and Mudita, who really worked all the time in making this conference happen. Thank you, everyone. A big shout out to all of you for patiently being with us all this time. Hopefully, we all learned a lot, and we'll carry forward the initiative going ahead. Have a good dinner and cocktails, and Jai Hind. Thank you.
And last but not the least, I think this conference would not have been possible without Chirantan. And so thank you so much, Chirantan. And as we do things in ISB for this great contribution, your punishment will be that you'll have to do it again. Thank you, everybody.